Welcome to Hydrogen Rising, a bi-weekly podcast created and hosted by the global law firm K&L Gates that brings you analysis of critical, cutting-edge issues impacting the global hydrogen market. We look forward to your engagement and feedback. And of course, don't hesitate to reach out if you have ideas about new topics you'd like us to cover.
Welcome back to Hydrogen Rising, everyone. I'm David Wochner, a partner in the Washington, D.C. office of the global law and policy firm K&L Gates and co-lead of our firm's global hydrogen practice. Thanks again for joining us for this next installment of our podcast, Hydrogen Rising. This is episode 18. And today is actually part 2 of our focus on U.S. tax incentives for hydrogen and clean energy. You'll recall that in our last episode, I spoke with my partner here at K&L Gates, Elizabeth Krause, about a range of issues related to the effectiveness of clean energy tax incentives, including some of the limitations that are presented by existing incentive mechanisms, and importantly for the hydrogen industry, some new proposed legislation from U.S. Senator Tom Carper, a Democrat from Delaware, which creates a production tax credit and investment tax credit for hydrogen, a PTC and ITC, which those certainly in the clean energy sector are well familiar with in the solar and wind area. Today, I'm very excited to be joined by my colleague, Mary Burke Baker, a government affairs counselor in the K&L Gates Public Policy Group. In addition to leading our tax policy practice, Mary very much has a storied career here in D.C., both at the IRS as well as a senior advisor to the Senate Finance Committee. And honestly, I am fortunate to receive Mary's daily email updates on all things tax policy going on in Washington, and it is truly informative and insightful. So Mary, welcome to the podcast, and thanks for being with us.
Thanks, David. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, so let's maybe level set here at the outset for our listeners. You've been working on and around Capitol Hill and the politics of tax policy for many years. There's so much activity, so much negotiation and discussion on Capitol Hill right now related to infrastructure and energy. And obviously, President Biden has doubled down on these issues, and it's, they're kind of key parts of his administration's platform and their commitment to decarbonization. Can you, for our listeners, we have folks all over the world, some who may not be so steeped in Washington as you and I. Could you lay the groundwork here at the outset on where things currently stand on Capitol Hill in Washington with regard to infrastructure legislation and kind of the general lay of the land?
Sure. I guess to put it very succinctly, we're in somewhat of a state of confusion right now. And no one really knows exactly what's going to happen or how it's going to play out. If anybody has been watching during the last several weeks, there's been a big push for some sort of a bipartisan infrastructure bill. President Biden has been meeting with what I call gangs of senators, and the gangs kind of change and morph from time to time, but the players change, but the approach is still the same, that they are trying to work among themselves as a gang and then work with the White House to try to come up with some sort of a bipartisan agreement on infrastructure. It's unclear whether that is actually maybe part of a kabuki, whether Republicans do ever intend to come up with a deal with the president, but it is somewhat of a game of both sides, kind of like a mating dance. They're just going through their moves and wanting to make it look like each one wants to have a bipartisan deal. But at the end of the day, my personal opinion is I don't think that there probably is going to be a bipartisan deal. I think that the latest effort is probably Democrats are getting very impatient and they want the administration, the president, to kind of move on and say we're going to just do a partisan Democratic bill. So I think in the next week or 10 days, we're probably going to see some sort of resolution, meaning probably not a deal and a bipartisan approach, and Democrats are going to go full-throated toward budget reconciliation. So what is budget reconciliation? Budget reconciliation is this really arcane budget procedure which requires only 51 votes in the Senate. And that's important because President Biden, Democrats only have 51 votes in the Senate under the best of circumstances. It's an even split of 50-50 of Republican and Democratic senators, and then with Vice President Harris's vote, that gives Democrats 51 votes. And I should mention, I think it's relevant to this discussion, that the House, the Democrats in the House have a somewhat larger margin, but just a handful of seats. You can count them on less than both hands the number of seats of margin that they have in the House. So it's sort of the context of all of this is that even as we're talking about a Democratic bill, that is, Democrats are not a homogeneous group. You have progressives, and you have Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema on the right side of the spectrum, and it's going to be difficult, I think, even for them as a party to come up with policies that they can all agree on, because infrastructure ranges all the way from roads and bridges and ports and things like that, what we might traditionally think of as infrastructure, to kind of a middle ground broadband. Both parties seem to think that broadband is kind of a new player in the infrastructure space, but probably deserves to be there. And then we have proposals really on the more far left side of more what are called human infrastructure, which includes, guaranteed free preschool and a couple of years of community college and family and sick leave and things like that. So there's a broad spectrum in the Democratic Party, and it's not going to be that easy for them to agree among themselves on a bill. So kind of getting back to budget reconciliation, as I mentioned, budget reconciliation, it's this arcane process. It is a budget mechanism, which means that in order to put something in a budget reconciliation bill, it has to have a budgetary impact. So that means that it either has to impact revenues, it has to impact spending, it can also impact the debt limit. And so that means that things like pilot programs and setting emissions standards and things like that, if Democrats have to move down this budget reconciliation road to be able to get the votes they need, there's going to be things on energy policy that they would like to put in there, but they are just not going to be able to procedurally include in a bill.
Because they don't affect the budget, like you said, a pilot program or an R&D program or something like that.
That's exactly right. And the other interesting thing about budget reconciliation is that you cannot add to the deficit outside the 10-year budget window. So if you've looked at any of these proposals that are out there, a lot of them are running out before the end of the decade. And part of that reason is because you can't add to the debt limit or to the deficit outside that 10-year budget window, which means then you either have to sunset, you have to just stop things abruptly, or they have to be fully paid for. And that would be the last thing I would say just about the process if anybody is watching this and looking at the debate over how is infrastructure going to be paid for. I think if it was just the policy, they could probably come to an agreement. But the pay-fors are what are the real rub. The Democrats are focusing on increasing taxes on the wealthy, increasing taxes on large corporations, not increasing any taxes on people making under $400,000 a year. That is just anathema to the Republicans because it involves clawing back on the Republican 2017 tax reform bill, which was all about reducing tax rates, and now the Democrats want to increase them. So the two parties are at a real impasse on how to pay for infrastructure.
And hence your crystal ball reading that you think a bipartisan piece of legislation is probably quite challenged. That makes a lot of sense. So let's maybe dig in a bit on to the tax component of this now and how tax-focused legislation, whether incentives or other things in the context of infrastructure and clean energy, how that plays into this ongoing debate about a broader infrastructure piece of infrastructure legislation and spending on infrastructure. Can you talk to us a bit about what you're seeing on the Hill with regard to tax proposals for clean energy and how you see them kind of fitting in as a puzzle piece in this infrastructure effort?
You hit the nail on the head. That part of the debate about what constitutes infrastructure includes is clean energy, are energy incentives part of infrastructure or not? The energy grid, I think particularly with some of the recent hacks, I think that's really raised the specter of whether the energy grid and having some redundancy on the energy grid and security should be part of infrastructure. And I don't think that there's really consensus on that. But then you have other incentives for particular new technologies and things like that. You have kind of a fundamental philosophical difference of opinion between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans tend to be more market driven and not necessarily so inclined to provide really long-term incentives for technologies. They think that the market should drive success or failure, and Democrats are more focused, as a general rule, and this is just a generalization, but are more focused just, looking at the climate and emissions levels and things like that and trying to take a longer term approach to incentivizing technologies that are going to address those concerns. So as a result, for example, the bipartisan bills that have been discussed with the administration that the Senate gangs have come up with have not really included a broad clean energy policy. And there are members, particularly progressives in the House, Democrats, who are saying we're not voting for any infrastructure bill unless it includes clean energy incentives and emissions incentives. And there are also some Democratic senators that feel the same way. So I don't think you're going to get an infrastructure bill, a reconciliation bill across the finish line with Democrats unless it includes at least significant amount of clean energy incentives. And there is a question as this is all going on, is this all going to fall through and there won't be any energy incentives at all in an infrastructure bill? But I think particularly because of progressives in the House that really can, they're the fulcrum of whether something passes or not. They have the power to be able to force something to be in there. And we see versions of all sorts of energy incentives, and they're coming from the White House, they're coming from the Senate Finance Committee, from the Ways and Means Committee, from individual members. Stakeholders are providing their suggestions, and it's, covering the usual suspects of wind and solar, but really expanding into hydrogen. There are several proposals now that are focused on hydrogen, as well as, other electric vehicles and fueling stations and energy storage. Those are all coming more to the fore.
One of the points of debate over the years between Democrats and Republicans are existing tax incentives for traditional oil and gas companies. And I know there's been I think the president's recent proposal came out and indicated the elimination of substantial tax provisions that have benefited the oil and gas industry. How do you see, without getting into the specifics of any one element of it, how do you see that debate playing out as the president's budget kind of moves forward? Like, what does that look like?
2 words: Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin is a very powerful senator from West Virginia. West Virginia, the last time I checked, had a lot of fossil fuels.
Yes, they do.
A lot of people rely on fossil fuels for jobs and their livelihood in West Virginia. Joe Manchin is not going to vote for any infrastructure bill that repeals fossil fuels. But you're exactly right, David, that the administration has proposed to repeal a whole litany of fossil fuel incentives. In a Senate Finance Committee markup a couple of weeks ago, that included a repeal of fossil fuel incentives. There have been proposals by senators, Democratic senators, that would repeal fossil fuel incentives. And no matter how many proposals are out there, it is just, I will give you 99.5% certainty, not a guarantee, but quite sure that Joe Manchin is not going to vote to repeal fossil fuel incentives across the board. So I just don't think that that's going to happen.
Oh, sorry, one quick follow-up on that. I appreciate that, and certainly I agree based on what I know of Senator Manchin. I'm curious, are there any Republicans who are moderate and who might go along with it, or are the politics of this such that it'll be a unified bloc on the Republican side? And actually, one particular note, interestingly, when you look at someone like Senator Murkowski, for example, who has shown a strong tendency toward bipartisanship and toward engagement across the aisle, this is one area where she absolutely would not sign on because, similarly, oil and gas are so important in Alaska. So I'd be curious your thoughts on the Republican side.
I cannot think, in going through the catalog of Republican senators in my head, I cannot think of one Republican that would vote for that. I think they're going to stick together. And, Leader McConnell, Minority Leader McConnell in the Senate runs a pretty tight ship. And I just don't think that this is going to be one of those areas where people are going to stray from sticking together on fossil fuels. But I think it's also just worth mentioning that in these proposals, they're all across the board on, what types of energy they may be trying to incentivize or technologies. But there's also a significant difference in the way that the Finance Committee is approaching these incentives and the administration and the House are approaching these incentives. The administration, and none of them are exactly the same. The administration has theirs. In the Green Book, which is part of the budget submissions to Congress. It just came out May 28th, which was, I remember that date very well because it was the Friday before the Memorial Day holiday. I guess what I spent my day doing.
Of course. And that the Green Book, for those who are not Beltway insiders, the Green Book is issued by the administration. Is that correct? By the Treasury Department?
It is Treasury, IRS, they all have some input into it, but it is part of the administration's budget proposal that just went over to Congress for FY 2022. And it literally is a little book, probably a quarter, maybe a half-inch thick, and it literally has a green cover, and it's full of tax compliance, tax administration proposals. And so there were a number of energy incentive type proposals. The administration has a very aggressive emissions goals, and so there were a number of clean energy proposals in that Green Book. So the administration has theirs, Ways and Means. The House have the Green Act, which includes their own set of proposals, and most of those are either expansions or extensions or both of existing energy code sections and policies. So they just sort of took what we've already been doing and just expanded, enhanced it. On the Finance Committee side, however, Chairman Wyden has taken a different approach. He's taken what's called a technology neutral approach. So in that case, taxpayers would have the choice. So the investment tax credit, production tax credit, which are the two most traditional types of incentives. And I think that Elizabeth talked about that on the last podcast, the difference between production incentivizes, as its name implies, production. The investment tax credit really is intended to incentivize or help underwrite the actual cost of building the facility that's going to be producing the clean energy. So instead of having to, stick to one or the other, the Wyden proposal would allow taxpayers to choose. If the investment tax credit is more advantageous to them, then they can choose that. If the production tax credit is more advantageous to them, they can choose that. And the Wyden proposal is based on a carbon emissions baseline. So the amount of the credit or incentive you would get would be calibrated based on that carbon emissions baseline. The more emissions savings, the greater your credit. And interestingly enough, Ranking Member Crapo on the Senate Finance Committee, the Republican, also has a technology neutral bill, but it's not the same as Chairman Wyden's technology neutral bill. So Crapo's bill is based on market saturation or market penetration. So as the technology, kind of true to the market, the Republican market-based approach, as a technology penetrates the market and becomes more available and used more, then his credit would phase down. But it would also be based on a technology neutral approach.
So that's very helpful. And I think that's actually a really good segue into a closing topic that as we kind of dig in a bit on hydrogen-specific initiatives. So Elizabeth and I, in the last episode, talked about Senator Carper's proposal, which does create, as you were just talking about, a PTC and ITC for hydrogen. And kind of similar to what you were talking about just now, the credit is measured against the carbon intensity of the hydrogen that is being produced, and the transition away from hydrogen that is produced from natural gas and toward hydrogen that is produced from water via electrolysis and the use of clean energy in the electrolysis process. So that's Carper's legislation. Senator Martin Heinrich from New Mexico, Democrat from New Mexico, obviously a major natural gas producing state. In fact, I believe New Mexico produces more natural gas from federal lands than any other state in the country. He introduced a new legislation that would create Section 45U, which is a clean hydrogen production credit, as I understand it. There's also a bipartisan bill from Senator Whitehouse from Rhode Island, a Democrat, and Senator Todd Young, a Republican, which would amend Section 45. So we've got all of these kind of competing pieces of legislation from different members of Congress with a hydrogen focus. And so I guess, and then, sorry to go on, but earlier this week, U.S. Secretary of Energy Jennifer Granholm announced this major initiative by the Energy Department called Energy Earthshot. And the focus is, like the moonshot, this is going to be, move the United States into the next generation, the next era of energy. And they announced that the kickoff, the leading edge of this is going to be a hydrogen Earthshot. And so clearly the administration has a focus on hydrogen. So as listeners are thinking about project development and they're thinking about investments from private equity and from banks into the hydrogen sector, can you talk to us about how any of these pieces of legislation will play out? Does Carper's take precedent because he's chair of Environment and Public Works? I know it doesn't work that way, but kind of give folks the sense of what are the politics, what's the timing, and how do any one of these kind of make it to the finish line and be part of something that gets signed into law?
It's a really great question. In some sense, it's sort of like a beauty contest. All these members introduce their proposals, and they're hoping that they're the ones that are going to catch fire and that they're going to get a lot of support.
Who will get the tiara and the roses at the end of the day?
That's right. And you see a lot of similarities. They're not all totally different. There's a lot of similarities. There's a lot of commonalities. But it gives people time to look at these proposals, to kick the tires. They're going to go, if it involves anything that involves the tax code, folks are going to go to the tax committees and they're going to say, we like this about this bill, we don't like this about this bill. And at the end of the day, it's the tax committees, and to be totally realistic about it, it's also leadership, because leadership has to figure out what's going to sell among their members. Nancy Pelosi has to make sure that she has the votes to pass whatever, and so does Leader Schumer in the Senate. So they're all out there and they're all kind of competing, and stakeholder, this is one thing I think is really important that folks should know, is that stakeholder input in these situations is very important. And I mean, I say that because that's what I do. I am a registered lobbyist and I work on Capitol Hill with Capitol Hill all the time. But it is stakeholder input into the tax committees, the committees of jurisdiction with your members of Congress is extremely important. If there's something in any of these bills that you like or you don't like, you need to let them know, because that will have an impact on what the final product is, whether it's technology neutral or whether it's just an extension and expansion of what we've been seeing all along. What is going to happen is that all of these proposals are out there, and then as an infrastructure bill comes together, something is going to get incorporated into that infrastructure bill. Mm-hmm. And it could be bits and pieces of each of these bills. It could be one of these bills in whole cloth, although that generally doesn't happen. It could be a version of these bills. The percentages could change, or the thresholds could change, or something like that. But they're all just sort of raw material that the Finance Committee and the Ways and Means Committee can take as they are drafting their proposals. And we don't know yet what's going to end up in the bills and what's not going to end up in the bills. But it's always an interesting process, and it's just, I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to realize that you as a stakeholder can make a huge amount of difference in what ends up in the final legislation.
Thanks for spending time with us, folks, I think, who don't live here in D.C., who don't spend day in and day out like we do, thinking about policy and regulatory issues and how the politics play out. Often, we'll say that things seem a bit out of reach, and I think our conversation today has really helped bring some of this down to earth for folks, so I appreciate you spending time with us.
Well, it was my pleasure, David, and really enjoyed the conversation.
With that, we'll close today's episode. Thanks to all of our listeners for joining us today. Of course, if you like what you hear on Hydrogen Rising, don't forget to go subscribe to the podcast. And of course, you can always give us 5 stars in the podcast app. If you have any questions about these issues we talked about today, tax incentives, what's going on Capitol Hill, please don't hesitate to reach out to me or my colleague Mary Baker, my guest today. You can find both of us on our website at www.klgates.com. And of course, stay tuned for the next episode of Hydrogen Rising in 2 weeks. Thanks.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Hydrogen Rising. Be sure to subscribe to receive timely notifications of future episodes and check out our market-leading publication, The Hydrogen Handbook, on our website at www.klgates.com.